There are houses in the Highlands that seem to remember better than the people who live in them. Achnacairn Croft, high above Lochdubh, was one of those places. Peat-smoked, rain-bitten, and crowded with old iron, folded linen, family pride, and stories polished smooth by being told too often. Now the MacIvors meant to open it as a little heritage museum, with labels on every pot and a famous cradle quilt at the heart of it all. But old objects do not always agree to be useful, and when a blue enamel tag begins to chip, Hamish Macbeth notices that something more than a quilt has gone missing. Chapter 1. The Croft Above the Burn. The first sign that Achnacairn Croft had become important was that everyone in Lochdubh began pronouncing it differently. Mrs. Wellington said it grandly, as if it were a small cathedral. Patel called it the old MacIver place, which had the benefit of being understood. Nessie Curry said her father had always called it Achnacairn, and Jessie agreed, although neither of them had ever climbed farther up that hill than the lower blackberry hedge. Hamish Macbeth knew it as the draughty croft above the burn, with the leaning byre, the smoky chimney, and the scullery roof that had been needing attention since before he joined the police. That morning, the weather gave it all the attention it could want. Rain drove sideways across Lochdubh. The burn below the croft ran high and brown, flinging itself under the little stone bridge. At the police station, Hamish's stove gave one tired cough and went out. He stared at it in his socks. "That," he said, "is no a helpful attitude." Lugs, curled on Hamish's coat by the wall, opened one eye and looked as if the failure were Hamish's personal disgrace. By 10 o'clock, Mrs. Patel had heard of the stove. By past, she had sent up a tin of soup, a heel of bread, and a message that Hamish was not to pretend biscuits counted as dinner. Since the road to Achnacairn was worsening, Hamish decided to take the soup himself and see whether the MacIvors needed warning about the track. Lugs came as far as the Land Rover willingly, then looked betrayed when the journey involved rain. Achnacairn Croft sat grey and stubborn against the hillside. A new hand-painted sign had been fixed beside the gate. Achnacairn Heritage Croft. Open day. This Saturday, the Massiver Family Collection. Inside, the house smelled of peat smoke, wet wool, furniture polish, and old stone. Every surface seemed to hold something labelled: butter churns, iron pots, wool cards, christening gowns, boots stiff with age, a cracked blue bowl, a black kettle, and spoons dull from long service. Ewan MacIver stood near the hearth, directing two volunteers as they moved a blanket chest a few inches to the left. "No, not staged," he said. "Natural, as if it has always been there." His Aunt Kirsty, seated at the kitchen table with a pencil and a stack of labels, gave a dry little snort. "It has always been there. That is why moving it about like a shop display looks foolish." Ewan turned quickly when he saw Hamish. "Constable Macbeth, good of you to come up." "Mrs. Patel sent soup," said Hamish, "which is a higher authority than the police." Kirsty smiled without looking up. She was small, sharp, and wrapped in a dark cardigan mended at both elbows. Her white hair was pinned back plainly. She had the look of a woman who had spent her life saving things other people later called heritage. "It says here," she said, tapping a label, "that the big pot was used for festive broth." Festive broth, my foot. "It was used for washing sheets when the copper cracked." Ewan laughed in a polished way. "Aunt Kirsty likes accuracy. I like not lying to strangers for £6 a ticket." Before Ewan could answer, the door opened, and a woman in a dark green coat stepped in out of the rain. She removed her hood, shook water from her sleeves, and looked around the kitchen with calm dissatisfaction. Victorine Dale had arrived. She was the visiting Heritage Collections auditor from Inverness, though Nessie Curry had already promoted her to museum inspector, and Jessie had claimed she could close a place down with one tick on a form. Victorine was not tall, but she made the room straighten itself. She carried a clipboard and a packet of white cotton gloves. "Mr. MacIver," she said, "I thought it best to arrive before everyone was ready." Ewan's smile faltered. "Naturally. We are delighted. People are seldom delighted by inspection." She put on her gloves, finger by finger, and nodded to Hamish. "Constable, are you here officially?" "Only as escort to soup?" Kirsty gave a small, approving sound. Victorine began in the front room, where the best pieces had been arranged for the open day. A cradle stood near the inner wall, dark with age, and rubbed smooth at the rockers. Above it hung a fresh card, the Missiva cradle, used by 6 generations, with original family quilt. There was no quilt in it. Instead, the cradle held a folded linen cloth and a small blue enamel inventory tag tied to one side with wire. Victorine bent over it. "Where is the quilt?" Yuan answered too quickly. "Upstairs, being aired." Kirsty looked at him as if he had said the minister was being boiled. "Being what?" "Aired," said Yuan. "Quilts do not need airing in a locked bedroom 2 days before visitors come to see them." Victorine's pencil paused. "Locked bedroom?" "The best room," said Kirsty. "Though it is only called that because fewer things died in it." Yuan flushed. "My aunt has a picturesque turn of phrase." "I have memory," said Kirsty. "It is less fashionable." Victorine lifted the blue enamel tag from the cradle. It was oval, chipped along one edge, with a white number painted on it. As she turned it toward the light, 2 tiny blue-white flakes fell onto the dark table beside the cradle. Hamish noticed them. Victorine noticed Hamish noticing. "Recent damage," she said. Yuan leaned in. "The cradle has been moved several times. Volunteers, you know. Volunteers rarely damage only the useful evidence," said Victorine. She read the number. 17. Kirsty's mouth tightened. "The cradle quilt was 17, she said. Yuan said, "Yes, of course. But there is no quilt," said Hamish mildly. Rain struck the window hard enough to make the old glass shiver. Victorine turned to Yuan. "I shall need to see the quilt, the household ledger, and any earlier provenance note for item 17. The ledger is rather fragile," said Yuan. Kirsty put down her pencil. "That ledger survived 3 children, 2 floods, your father's temper, and a goat that got in one hogmanay. It can survive a woman with gloves." For the first time, Victorine almost smiled. Hamish looked again at the little blue-white flakes on the table. Outside, the burn ran higher. Inside, among all those carefully labelled things, the missing quilt had made the loudest statement in the room. Chapter 2, The Perfect Label. Victorine Dale did not raise her voice. That was what made her so effective. A loud inspector could be disliked and dismissed. A woman who merely stood beside a badly labelled butter churn and waited for the truth to embarrass itself was far more dangerous. "This is not a butter churn," she said. Yuan McIver looked at the tall wooden object as if hoping it might defend itself. "It has always been called that in the family." "Families call things many things," said Victorine. "That does not make them accurate." Kirsty, still seated at the kitchen table, did not look up from the labels. "It's a meal gurnal," she said, "for storing oatmeal. The churn was broken before I was born." Yuan gave another of his smooth little laughs. "There we are. Living memory is invaluable." "Only when listened to before the card is printed," said Kirsty. Hamish stood near the range with a cup of tea Kirsty had forced into his hand. Lugs had settled by the hearth, chin on paws, watching the room with the serious patience of a creature waiting for bannocks. The old croft creaked around them. Rain tapped at the windows, sometimes lightly, sometimes hard, as if trying different ways to be admitted. The front room had been arranged with great care. That was the trouble with it. Nothing looked accidental enough to be true. A pair of boots had been placed beneath a chair at a charming angle. A shawl had been folded over the back of a settle as if a crofter's wife had just stepped out, though Hamish suspected no crofter's wife in history had ever arranged her hardship for lighting. Victorine moved from object to object. "The widow's shawl," she read. Kirsty made a small choking sound. Yuan looked pained. "Is there a problem?" "It's not a widow's shawl," said Kirsty. "It was my mother's good wrap for church, and she wore it 20 years before my father died." Victorine checked the weave. "Also later than the date on the label." Yuan's fingers tightened around the edge of his clipboard. "That date came from an old family note. Then the note is wrong." There was no cruelty in Victorine's tone. That almost made it crueler. She was not attacking the McIvers. She was simply removing the parts that had been embroidered. One of the volunteers, a red-haired girl from the next glen, carried in a tray of cups and set it down too heavily. The cups rattled. Everybody looked at them with relief, because crockery was easier than shame. "Tea?" said Yuan brightly. "After the ledger," said Victorine. A little silence followed. Hamish saw Yuan's eyes move, not toward the stairs where the best room lay, but toward the old dresser in the kitchen. It was a quick glance, almost nothing. Kirsty saw it too. "The ledger is in the dresser," she said. "I had moved it," said Yuan. "Had you?" "For safety. Things are always safest," said Kirsty, "until someone starts making them safe." Victorine took off her gloves and laid them on the table. "Mr. McIver, I asked yesterday in my letter for original household records to be available." "And they are," said Yuan. "Only the ledger is fragile. The spine has begun to go." "The spine was going in 1968, said Kirsty. "So was mine. Both of us are still here." Hamish sipped his tea. "It was strong enough to put courage into a coward and suspicion into a saint." Yuan crossed to the dresser and opened the lower cupboard. He moved a stack of folded cloths, a biscuit tin, and a bundle of old newspaper before bringing out a thick ledger bound in cracked brown leather. He carried it as if it were a sleeping child. Victorine accepted it with care, though not reverence. Hamish liked that about her. She respected objects, but she did not worship them. People did enough damage worshipping things. She opened the ledger on the table. Kirsty leaned forward despite herself. "There," she said, pointing. "That is my grandmother's hand. She made her sevens like hooks." Victorine scanned the page. "Item 17, cradle quilt, blue and white patchwork, made partly from wedding linen and partly from worn shirts." "Aye," said Kirsty softly. For the first time that morning, her sharpness thinned into something more vulnerable. "My sister slept under that quilt when she was a baby. I did too. It was not grand. It was just ours," Yuan said quickly. "Which is exactly why it will be the emotional centerpiece of the open day." Kirsty's face closed again. "Emotional centerpiece," she repeated, as if tasting something unpleasant. Victorine turned another page. There should be an older note attached to the item. A receipt for repair work, perhaps. The ledger mentions new binding to blue edge. Yuan shook his head. "I have never seen such a note." Kirsty said nothing. Hamish noticed that. Kirsty McIver was not a woman built for silence unless silence was doing work. Victorine closed the ledger halfway and looked toward the bare cradle. "Then we must see the quilt." "It is upstairs," said Yuan. "So you said." "It was damp when we brought it out." "No, it wasn't," said Kirsty. Yuan turned on her with sudden irritation. "Aunt Kirsty, please." The room heard the please and understood it was not a request. Kirsty sat back. Outside, the wind pushed rain hard against the wall. Somewhere overhead, the drip into the pail quickened. Hamish set down his cup. "I can fetch it if the stairs are awkward." "No," said Yuan. "Too fast." Victorine looked at him. Yuan recovered. "I mean, the best room is not ready. There are boxes everywhere. I would rather not risk damage." "You risk more by delaying," said Victorine. He smiled again, but now the smile looked tired of being used. "Miss Dale, this is a family collection. It has been kept safe by my family for generations. Then your family should welcome proof that it is what you say." That struck home. For a moment, only the rain spoke. Then the red-haired volunteer, still hovering by the cup, said, "I saw a bundle on the landing this morning." Everyone turned. She went pink. "Only when I came in. Mr. McIver was carrying it, wrapped in brown paper." Yuan's voice was gentle. "That was not the quilt, Morag. That was display cloth." "Oh," she said, relieved to be corrected. But Hamish noticed she did not look certain. Kirsty reached across the table and tapped the ledger. "Blue and white," she said. "Not brown paper. Not emotional. Not centerpiece. Blue and white, worn at the binding. Victorine reopened her notebook and wrote a line. Hamish was close enough to see only a few words. Cradle quilt provenance inconsistent, tag 17. Yuan saw the direction of Hamish's gaze and moved between him and the table. It was neatly done. Too neatly. At last, Victorine put away her pencil. "I will return tomorrow morning," she said. "At 10. I expect to see the quilt, the tag board, and any documents relating to item 17. If they are not produced, I cannot approve the collection for public display." Yuan's face had gone pale beneath its polish. That would be most unfortunate. "Yes," said Victorine. "False history often is." She gathered her gloves and clipboard. Kirsty watched her with a curious expression. Dislike, respect, and fear, all folded together. Hamish stepped toward the door. He had no official reason to stay, and several unofficial reasons not to leave. But in Lochdubh, suspicion worked best when it looked like idleness. "I'll be seeing you then," he said. Yuan followed him into the kitchen passage. "Hamish," he said quietly, "you know how these things are. A village needs something hopeful. People come for stories." "Aye," said Hamish, "but they usually prefer them true." Yuan gave a thin smile. "Do they?" Hamish did not answer. As he opened the door, cold rain rushed into the croft. Behind him, in the front room, the cradle sat bare beneath its perfect label, and on the table beside it, one tiny blue-white flake still clung to the dark wood. Chapter 3. A stove, a storm, and a lie. By the time Hamish got back to the police station, his socks were wet through, and his stove had not improved with solitude. He stood before it, removed the front plate, poked at the dead heart of it, and got a smear of soot across his wrist for his trouble. The little kitchen smelled of damp wool, old tea, and defeat. "Well," he said to Luggs, "we are living historically now." Luggs, who had enjoyed Achnacairn's warm flagstones and did not see why he should suffer for Hamish's principles, turned his back. A scratch came at the window. Hamish looked up. Sonsie sat outside on the sill, dry as polished bone, staring in at him through the glass. She gave the cold kitchen one long inspection, then vanished into the rain with the air of a creature declining poor accommodation. "That's loyalty for you," said Hamish. He tried the stove once more. It gave a puff of smoke, enough to make his eyes water, and then died again. Before he could decide whether to kick it or pray over it, the telephone rang. It was Elspeth Grant. "I hear you've been up at Achnacairn," she said, without greeting. "News travels faster than I do. It always has. Is the open day still happening? That depends on the road, the roof, and whether the family can find the thing they're advertising." There was a pause. "What thing?" "The cradle quilt." "Oh, that." Elspeth's voice sharpened with interest. "The paper wants a small feature. Old croft, local memory, family resilience. That sort of thing." "Aye. There's a lot of resilience on labels these days." She laughed. "You sound suspicious." "I sound cold." "You're always suspicious when cold." Hamish looked at the dead stove. "Then I'm a very suspicious man tonight." Elspeth softened a little. "Come down to the restaurant. I'll tell them you're starving." "I'm no starving." "You're eating biscuits and calling it discipline." That was too close to the truth to argue with. The Italian restaurant in Lochdubh was warm, bright, and full of the sort of comfort Hamish mistrusted only when he could not afford it. The windows were steamed at the edges. A few villagers sat over plates of pasta, discussing the weather as if it had behaved badly in public. Enrico brought Hamish soup without asking, then bread, then more bread. "You eat," he said. "You look like a wet fence post. I've been compared to worse." "By Blair, probably." Hamish took the soup gratefully. It was rich, hot, and full of garlic. He had just begun to feel that life was not entirely designed to irritate him when the restaurant door opened and Mrs. Patel came in to collect a takeaway. She saw him at once. "Good," she said. "You are eating something with colour." I'm being supervised from all sides. That is because you require it. Elspeth arrived soon after, cheeks bright from the rain, notebook already in hand. I won't quote you, she said, sitting opposite him. That is what reporters say before making a man famous for the wrong sentence. I mean it. Tell me about Achnacairn. Hamish stirred his soup. There's an old croft full of old things. Some are what they claim to be. Some are no. Victorine Dale can tell the difference, which makes her unpopular. Elspeth wrote the name down. Victorine. Good name for an auditor. She wears it well. And Ewan McIver? Too smooth. That is not evidence. It's an early warning. Elspeth smiled but did not dismiss it. She knew Hamish well enough to understand that his laziness often hid a sort of listening. He remembered what people said, but more importantly, he remembered when they spoke too soon. The aunt? She asked. Kirsty. Sharp as a darning needle. Tired. Proud. More truthful than comfortable. And the missing quilt? Hamish looked toward the rain-dark window. Yuan said it was upstairs before anyone properly accused it of being missing. That could be nerves. Aye, but you don't think it was? I think Victorine asked where it was, and Yuan had his answer ready, like a man who had rehearsed being casual. Elspeth wrote nothing for a moment. Objects lie only when people ask them to, Hamish said. Is that yours? No. Victorine Dale's. Good line. It's not meant as one. The restaurant telephone rang near the counter. Enrico answered, listened, then called, Hamish, Strathbane. Hamish sighed and went to it. Blair's voice came down the line, full of heat and irritation. What are you doing up at that croft, Macbeth? Getting wet. Don't be clever. I've had a call from McIver. Says you're sniffing about a family matter. He has a sensitive nose, then. It's a heritage open day, not a bank robbery. Don't turn some wee squabble over Granny's blanket into paperwork. Hamish leaned one shoulder against the wall and looked through the steamed glass toward the loch. There's an auditor asking questions. There's a missing object. There's a storm cutting up the track. Then let the storm have it. Half these croft folk dress poverty up as romance the minute there's a grant in it. Hamish's voice remained quiet, but something in it thinned. You'll no be saying that if you come up here, Blair. What? I said the line is poor. Must be the weather. There was a silence. Blair knew the tone. Just stay out of trouble, he snapped. It keeps moving toward me. Hamish hung up. When he returned to the table, Elspeth studied his face. Blair? Aye. Helpful. Like a hole in a roof. Hamish finished his soup, but the warmth had gone slightly out of the evening. He thought of Achnacairn's bare cradle, Kirsty's tight mouth, Victorine's pencil moving across the page, and those tiny blue-white flakes lying on the dark table. A missing quilt could be theft, vanity, family embarrassment, or nothing at all. But Yuan had answered too quickly. And in Hamish's experience, lies were often like bad stoves. They smoked before they failed. Chapter 4. The locked best room. By morning, the storm had stopped pretending to be weather and had become an event. The burn below Achnacairn was swollen almost to the bridgestones. Brown water shouldered past rocks and tore at grass roots along the bank. The track up to the croft had turned slick and rutted, and a shallow wash of mud had slid across the lower bend. Hamish drove slowly, one hand light on the wheel, lugs beside him making low, unhappy sounds whenever the Land Rover lurched. You insisted, said Hamish. Lugs looked away. He had no interest in past agreements. The call had come from Ewan McIver at 9:20. His voice had been too controlled. Miss Dale had not come down for breakfast. The best room door was locked. Kirsty said the room had been empty last night except for storage boxes and the quilt. Yuan said he had knocked and received no answer. Then, after much argument, they had looked through the keyhole and seen something on the floor. Hamish had told them not to touch anything. He did not believe for a second that no one had. Achnacairn Croft looked smaller in the rain. Smoke dragged low from the chimney. The hand-painted sign by the gate had loosened on one side and knocked gently against the post. Inside, The house was crowded with fear. Yuan stood in the passage, pale and carefully dressed. Kirsty sat at the kitchen table with both hands around a mug she was not drinking from. "Morag!" the red-haired volunteer cried quietly into a handkerchief. A second volunteer hovered near the door, eager to help and desperate to be sent away. Mrs. Patel was there too, raincoat buttoned to the throat and a shopping bag by her feet. "I came with bread," she said. "Then nobody wanted bread. That's when you know things are serious," said Hamish. The best room lay at the top of a narrow stair. Hamish climbed it alone. The door was old, swollen slightly by damp, and locked. The key was in the lock on the outside. "That key was missing last night," Ewan called from below. "I found it on the stair this morning." Hamish said nothing. He turned the key with care and opened the door. The best room smelled of damp fabric, cold ashes, and old wallpaper paste. A pail stood under a leak near the window. A tall display shelf had fallen forward, scattering labels, folded cloths, and small household objects across the floor. Victorine Dale lay beside it. There was no need for drama. Death in a small room had its own silence. Hamish stood still for a moment, not from shock, but from respect. Victorine had been alive yesterday with her white gloves and sharp pencil. Now she was part of the room everyone would talk about badly unless someone careful stopped them. He looked first, then moved. The shelf had fallen, but not naturally enough. One leg had caught on a strip of old rug. Several cards lay scattered near Victorine's clipboard. The clipboard itself was under the edge of the shelf, but the notebook was missing. The window was shut. Hamish crossed to it. The latch had been disturbed. The old paint around it was scratched. But when he looked down through the glass, the mud below showed no proper footprints. Only rain-pitted earth, flattened grass, and the splash marks of water falling from the sill. A locked room, thought Hamish, was usually a room where someone wanted a fool to admire the lock. He crouched beside Victorine. On the sleeve of her coat, near the cuff, a tiny blue-white flake clung to the wool. Hamish took out a clean envelope and, with the tip of his penknife, eased it free. Downstairs, Blair arrived with noise enough for 3 policemen. "Macbeth," he bellowed from the kitchen, "where the devil are you?" "In the house where the body is," Hamish called. It seemed relevant. Blair came up the stairs, breathing hard, his raincoat streaming onto the boards. "What have we got?" "A dead woman," said Hamish. "And a room that wants to look clever." Blair pushed past him, took one look at Victorine, and scowled as if she had inconvenienced him personally. "Old shelf fell. Could be accident." "Ah, yeah." Blair glanced at him. "What's that tone?" The tone of a man agreeing too early. Blair's gaze moved over the room. "Where's the quilt?" "That is one of the questions." "Oh, splendid. Murder over a blanket. The Highlands improves by the day." Hamish's face did not change. Blair noticed and looked away first. The local doctor arrived next, then Macnab from Strathbane, calmer and more useful than Blair. The room was measured, photographed, and marked. Hamish let official work happen around him while he watched Yuan at the stair-foot below. Yuan kept asking whether he should telephone the Heritage Committee. Kirsty never asked anything. When Hamish came down, Blair had already begun on her. "You had a key to that room?" Kirsty looked at him over her mug. "It is my house." "That's not an answer. It is the only one I have for a foolish question." Blair reddened. Yuan stepped in smoothly. "Aunt Kirsty has been upset. We all are." "Were you upset last night?" Blair demanded of Kirsty. "After arguing with Miss Dale?" Kirsty's eyes sharpened. "I corrected her." "There's a difference. You disliked her." "I disliked her manner. I respected her accuracy." Blair gave a snort. "Convenient." Hamish looked at the kitchen table. Victorine's teacup from yesterday had been removed. The blue flakes were gone too. Someone had wiped the surface clean. "Who tidied this table?" he asked. Mrs. Patel answered before anyone else could. "I did. Last night, after tea, there were crumbs." "Anything else?" She hesitated. Hamish waited. "A few blue specks," she said. "I thought from the old tag. I wiped them into the stove ash." Yuan let out a breath that might have been relief or annoyance. Blair said. Blue specks. What blue specks? Enamel, said Hamish. Speak English. I am. Hamish turned to Ern. Where is Victorine's notebook? Yuan blinked. I don't know. Surely upstairs. No, it must be somewhere. Aye, said Hamish. Things often are. Kirsty's fingers tightened around her mug. She wrote about item 17, she said. Yuan looked at her. Kirsty looked back. And in that look was old family war. Money, pride, duty, and years of swallowing words for the sake of the roof overhead. Blair saw only motive. Well, well, he said. Looks like Miss Dale was about to expose a family embarrassment. She exposed several before lunch yesterday, said Hamish. And your old lady there didn't like it. Kirsty smiled thinly. If I killed every person who annoyed me, Inspector, Lochdubh would have had a population problem years ago. Mrs. Patel made a small sound and covered it with a cough. Blair ignored her. Until we say otherwise, nobody leaves. Hamish glanced toward the window. Beyond it, the burn ran hard over the stones and the track shone with mud. I don't think they'll be holding a parade, Blair. But as he looked back at Yuan, then at Kirsty, then at the wiped kitchen table and the locked room above, Hamish felt the case settle into a colder shape. A missing quilt was trouble. A missing notebook was fear. And the little blue flake in his envelope was beginning to look less like damage than speech. Chapter 5. Bad stew, good bannocks. Blair decided the case required proper coordination, which meant everyone was taken to Strathbane, made uncomfortable, and given tea that tasted faintly of metal. Hamish sat in the police canteen opposite Blair, while rain ran down the windows in grey ropes. On the plate between them lay something called stew, though Hamish suspected the name had been applied in hope rather than evidence. Blair ate angrily. You've let this get sentimental, he said. I didna kill the woman to improve the mood. Don't be smart. Old aunt, old house, old family shame. It's as plain as a cow in a sitting room. Cows have surprised better men than you. Blair jabbed his fork at Hamish. Kirsty McIver had the key. She argued with the victim. She hated the inspection. And now the notebook page is missing. One page? Blair's scowl deepened. Macnab found the notebook under a folded sheet in the best room. Page torn out after a line about the cradle quilt. Provenance inconsistent, tag 17. That's your missing blue thing, is it not? Ah, yeah. There you are, then. There I am where? At Mative. Hamish looked at the stew and decided hunger had limits. Kirsty cared about the truth of the objects, he said. Victorine did too. They disliked one another's manner, maybe. But they were walking in the same direction. Blair snorted. Women can hate folk walking beside them. That has a ring of personal experience. Blair flushed. Macbeth. Hamish leaned back. He had the lazy look Blair hated most, because it usually meant he was thinking, what about Yuan? What about him? He was helpful before help was needed. That's called good manners, not in a murder inquiry. In a murder inquiry, good manners are often a form of tidying. Blair pushed his plate aside. I'll tell you what this is. An old woman built her life around being keeper of that croft. Along comes Miss Gloves from Inverness, says half the labels are rubbish, and threatens to stop the open day. The old woman panics. With arthritic fingers? What? The blue enamel tags are stiff. The wire is twisted tight. Kirsty's hands are bad. You saw her mug shaking. Blair waved that away. People manage when they're desperate. Aye, said Hamish. And sometimes policemen manage to see only what saves them work. The silence after that was not friendly. By mid-afternoon, Hamish returned to Achnacairn with Macnab, leaving Blair behind to shout at telephones. The storm had slackened, but the world still looked wrung out. Water ran in threads down the track. The burn was lower, though not by enough to trust it. Inside the croft, grief had been put to practical use. Kirsty was making bannocks. She stood at the kitchen table with flour on her sleeves, pressing dough flat with the heel of her hand. Her face was pale and drawn, but her movements were steady. There was comfort in that, Hamish thought. Not cheerfulness, not denial, but the ancient Highland knowledge that trouble still required food. Mrs. Patel sat near the range, peeling potatoes with quiet efficiency. "I tried to tell her to rest," she said. Kirsty did not look up. "And I tried to tell her, this is my kitchen, so we reached an agreement," said Mrs. Patel. "I am resting while peeling." Morag hovered by the dresser, red-eyed. Yuan stood near the doorway, speaking softly to a man from the Heritage Committee on the telephone. He had changed his shirt. Hamish noticed that. In a house where everyone else looked damp and slept in, Yuan looked prepared for public sympathy. When he finished the call, he came over at once. "Constable, Inspector Blair has surely told you I am at your disposal. Keys, lists, contact numbers, anything you need." "Aye," said Hamish. "You're very ready." Yuan's smile flickered. "Would you prefer me obstructive?" "I prefer folk ordinary." Kirsty gave the faintest snort and turned a bannock on the hot plate. Macnab, who had been checking the tag board in the front room, came back holding a clipboard. "Inventory board has a gap," he said. "Number 17 tag missing." Yuan frowned. "That cannot be right." "It is right," said Kirsty. Everyone looked at her. She kept her eyes on the bannocks. "It was there yesterday morning," Hamish said. "Before Victorine arrived?" "Aye. And after?" "I did not look." Yuan stepped forward. "Surely the tag on the cradle was 17. "That was a tag," said Hamish. "Not necessarily the tag." Macnab glanced at him. Hamish turned to Yuan. "How many blue tags were made?" "I don't know. 40, perhaps." The local craftman copied the old style. "We wanted the display to be consistent." "Copied? For missing labels," said Yuan. "Some old tags were lost over the years." Kirsty slapped a bannock onto a plate with unnecessary force. "The old ones were not lost. They were in a tobacco tin in the dresser until you decided rust was unattractive." Yuan closed his eyes briefly. "Aunt Kirsty, must everything become an accusation?" "In this house," she said, "things become accusations when someone moves them and then calls it improvement." Mrs. Patel said nothing. That was unusual enough for Hamish to notice. She had finished one potato and was turning it slowly in her hand, watching Yuan, not Kirsty. Hamish moved to the front room. The cradle sat as before, bare beneath its label. The blue tag tied to it looked convincing at a glance, but now that he knew to look, it seemed too clean around the wire, too recently handled. The edge was scraped raw, where enamel had flaked away. He did not touch it. Behind him, Yuan said, "This is destroying everything we hoped to do." "Miss Dale's death did that," said Hamish. "Yes, of course," Yuan swallowed. "I only meant the croft, the work, the funding. Aunt Kirsty does not understand how these projects are judged. They need a story. So you gave them one." "I presented what was true in spirit." Hamish looked at him. Yuan coloured. "You know what I mean?" "I'm learning." They returned to the kitchen. Kirsty placed bannocks on the table. Morag poured tea. Even Macnab accepted a plate with the solemn gratitude of a man who had seen the Strathbane canteen and survived. Blair arrived just as the first bannock was broken. He filled the doorway, wet and irritated. "Very cosy," he said. "A woman's dead upstairs, and you're having a sealage." Kirsty looked at him. "If you can find a better use for flour in a murder inquiry, Inspector, you may say so." Mrs. Patel hid a smile behind her cup. Blair ignored her and rounded on Kirsty. "You had access to the room. You argued with the victim. You hid records. And now a vital tag is missing." "I did not hide records." "You hid something." Kirsty's face changed. It was small, but Hamish saw it. A tightening near the mouth, a quick withdrawal of the eyes. Blair saw guilt. Hamish saw fear. "What did you hide?" Hamish asked gently. Kirsty looked down at her hands. "Letters," she said. Yuan went still. What letters? Blair snapped. Old ones. From my sister. From my mother. Not for display. Not for Yuan's pretty boards. Family things. Relevant to the quilt? Asked Hamish. Kirsty did not answer quickly enough. Yuan said, This is absurd. Aunt Kirsty hoards papers because she mistrusts change. Kirsty lifted her head. I mistrust people who call theft change. The kitchen went silent. Blair smiled with satisfaction, as if the case had just presented itself on a tray. Hamish looked from Kirsty's floury hands to Yuan's clean cuffs, from the missing tag-board to the bare cradle, and felt the neat answer Blair wanted become less neat by the minute. Outside, the rain eased. Inside, the bannock steamed gently on the plate, warm and ordinary in a room where everyone was beginning to lie with more care. Chapter 6. The Easy Aunt. Kirsty McIvor's bedroom was tucked under the slope of the roof, where the ceiling came down low enough to make Blair duck and Hamish tilt his head. It was not the sort of room anyone would put in a brochure. The wallpaper had faded to a colour between tea and old bone. A hot water bottle lay under a knitted cover on the bed. On the small table beside it sat a chipped mug, a tin of ointment, a pair of thick spectacles, and a little heap of letters tied with blue string. Through the narrow window, Hamish could see the track below, slick with rain and cut by brown water. The storm had trapped the croft in its own history. Blair stood in the doorway, too large for the room and too pleased with himself. So, he said, this is where you kept the hidden papers. Kirsty sat on the edge of the bed, hands folded in her lap. They were small hands, knuckled and bent by arthritis. Flour still clung in the cracks near her nails. They were not hidden, she said. They were mine. Anything looks private when it's useful to a murderer. Hamish moved to the window, partly to look out and partly so Blair would not see his face. Kirsty gave a tired smile. I have been called many things in this house, Inspector. Murderer is new. It often is, until it isn't. That must sound impressive in Strathbane. Blair reddened. Macbeth, ask your questions before I lose patience. You brought very little with you, said Hamish. Kirsty's eyes flicked toward him. Despite everything, amusement touched her mouth. You'll catch cold with socks like that. Hamish looked down. One sock had developed a small hole near the toe. Aye, well. They are a cry for help. Blair made a noise of disgust. For God's sake! Hamish ignored him and nodded toward the letters. May I? Kirsty hesitated. Then she lifted the bundle and placed it on the bed between them. My sister Myri wrote some of those. My mother wrote the rest. Owen wanted everything scanned, framed, and explained in tidy paragraphs. I did not want my mother's grief under glass. Grief about what? Asked Hamish. Kirsty looked at the sloping wall as if the answer were written there. Myri had a child young. Too young, folk said then. The baby died before winter. The quilt was made after that, not before. My grandmother used pieces from Myri's wedding linen and old shirts from the men. It was not some grand sixth-generation cradle treasure. It was a comfort after loss. Blair seized on it. So the label was false. Miss Dale found out. You didn't want the shame known. Kirsty turned to him slowly. The shame was never the child. The shame was how people spoke of the mother. The room went quiet. Even Blair had the sense not to trample that sentence at once. Hamish untied the blue string and looked through the letters carefully. They spoke in plain domestic fragments. Rain coming through the back room. A doctor sent for. Too late. A woman too young to carry so much sorrow. Scraps of blue cloth saved, because wasting good linen was a sin, even when the heart was broken. No confession. No threat. No reason for murder. Only an untidy truth Ewan would not have liked on a polished display board. Did Victorine know? Hamish asked. I think she guessed enough. She asked for the ledger and the repair note. Why did you not show her these? Kirsty's face tightened. Because she would have been right in public. That is a hard thing. When you are old, she said, People think the only thing you have left is your version. If they take that, they think they have taken you too. Blair folded his arms. But you respected her accuracy, you said. I did, and feared it. Aye, said Kirsty. Both can be true. Hamish looked at her hands again. Did you handle the blue inventory tags? Sometimes. The newer ones? No. Yuan ordered those. Said the old ones looked shabby. Could you remove one from the board? She lifted her right hand. The fingers trembled as she tried to pinch the air, not without swearing for 20 minutes and dropping it twice. Hamish almost smiled. Blair said, Convenient. It is not convenient, said Kirsty. It is painful. Hamish took from his pocket the envelope containing the blue-white enamel flake from Victorine's sleeve. He did not open it, only held it up to the light. Do you have any old tags here? Kirsty nodded toward a sewing box on the chair. In there. The ones Yuan did not throw away. Hamish opened the box. Beneath needles, buttons, and 2 thimbles lay 3 old blue enamel tags. Their edges were chipped, but dull with age. The exposed metal beneath had darkened. He tilted them toward the window. Old. Damage. Not sharp. Not fresh. He thought of the flake on Victorine's sleeve. Bright, clean-edged, newly broken. He thought of the tag tied to the cradle, too clean at the wire, and Yuan's glance toward the dresser when Victorine asked for the ledger. Blair was still watching Kirsty, as if guilt might rise off her like steam. You had motive, he said. You had access. I had a house, said Kirsty. I did not have a reason to kill a woman for noticing what I had noticed years ago. Hamish retied the letters. Who else knew about Myrie's child? Kirsty's eyes moved to the door. Yuan. His father told him enough. Not kindly. Would it damage the open day? It would damage Yuan's version. And what is Yuan's version? Kirsty looked suddenly very old. That the McIvers were always decent, always deserving, always wronged by weather, and never by themselves. Blair said, That sounds like every family I've ever met. No, said Hamish softly. Some families know they are lying. From below came the sound of Yuan's voice in the kitchen, smooth and low, thanking someone for their concern. Even muffled by floorboards, he sounded like a man accepting sympathy in advance. Kirsty heard it too. He wants the Croft to succeed, she said. I know that. He has debts. He says if the museum opens, it will save the place. What debts? She shook her head. I do not know. He stops talking when I come in. Hamish stood. Blair stepped back to let him pass, then said sharply, You're going soft on her. Hamish looked at Kirsty, at the letters, at the old tags in the sewing box, and at the hands that could barely pinch wire. No, he said. I'm only trying not to mistake sadness for guilt. As they went down the narrow stair, Blair muttered that sadness had fooled better men. Hamish did not answer. The case against Kirsty was tidy, visible, and easy to understand. That was what troubled him most. Chapter 7. Hamish makes it worse. By noon, the storm had eased enough for people to move about, which meant gossip could travel without risking its shoes. The road to Achnacairn remained poor, but the lower track into Lochdubh was passable if a driver had patience, good tyres, and no pressing love of suspension. Hamish came down from the Croft with mud on his boots, and a feeling that the case was slipping into the shape Blair preferred. Kirsty had motive enough for a man in a hurry. She had argued with Victorine. She had owned the room, the keys, and the letters. She had a family sorrow to protect. That was the sort of story official minds liked, because it had edges. But Hamish did not trust edges that had been cut for him. He stopped at Patel's shop for milk, matches, and a packet of oatcakes he did not need. The shop was crowded with people, pretending to buy things slowly. Mrs. Wellington was examining tins of peaches, as if the future of agriculture depended on them. Nessie Curry had a basket containing only 1 onion. Jessie had no basket at all, which made her harder to defend. Patel looked over his spectacles. Your stove is still dead. Mostly dead. That is not a category for stoves. It is in my house. Mrs. Patel, behind the counter, gave him a look that suggested she had already made arrangements and was only waiting for him to admit defeat. Hamish decided not to help her. Nessie leaned toward Jessie. "He has been at Achnacairn." "I can see the mud," said Jessie. "It is Croft mud," said Nessie. "Darker." Hamish took his milk. "Is there something wrong with the mud in Lochdubh now?" Nessie straightened. "We were saying nothing." "That would be a first worth noting." Mrs. Patel wrapped the oatcakes. "Leave the man alone. He has police matters." That was kindly meant and disastrous. Every ear in the shop became more polite. Hamish sighed inwardly. He had come to ask one small favour and found himself in front of Lochdubh's unofficial broadcasting service. "Mrs. Patel," he said, "may I have a word?" She followed him to the far end of the counter, where sacks of potatoes gave the illusion of privacy. "It is about Kirsty," he said quietly. "There are old family letters. They are private, and they do not make her guilty. I'd be obliged if that part did not go round the village." Mrs. Patel's face softened. "Of course." Hamish should have stopped there. "She'll be painted as spiteful if folk hear it wrong," he added. "Or confused. I understand." And she did. That was the trouble. Mrs. Patel understood people so well that she sometimes translated them for others before anyone asked. Hamish left with his milk, matches, oatcakes, and a sense that he had just placed a burning peat under dry heather. By 3 o'clock, Nessie had told Jessie that Kirsty had hidden shameful letters. By 10 past, Jessie had told Mrs. Wellington that the shameful letters might explain the missing quilt. By 1:30, someone in the harbour had decided the letters were a confession, though to what nobody could say. At 4, Blair found Hamish outside the police station, trying to persuade the stove repairman that Tuesday at the earliest was not an answer, but a moral collapse. Blair came striding through the rain with his collar turned up and triumph in his face. "Well done, Macbeth." Hamish looked at him. "That has never meant anything good from you. You let the whole village know your old auntie suspect has been hiding papers. Very community-minded policing." "I did not let the whole village know." "No? Did the hills tell them?" The repairman, sensing official weather, backed away with his toolbox. "I asked for discretion," said Hamish. Blair laughed. "In Lochdubh? You might as well ask a gull to keep a secret from chips." Hamish could not argue with that. Blair jabbed a finger toward him. "You've poisoned witnesses. Now everyone will say they always knew she was odd, always knew there was something wrong at the Croft. You've made my case noisier." "Your case was already noisy. It just had the wrong tune." Blair's face darkened. "You're protecting her." "I'm protecting the truth from being flattened." "Listen to yourself." The repairman coughed. "I'll come back Tuesday." "You'll come back today," said Hamish, with sudden sharpness. The man blinked. Blair looked amused, despite himself. "There's the law in action." Before Hamish could answer, a small van came too fast around the corner, braked badly, and stopped outside the shop. A young man climbed out, saw Hamish and Blair, and froze. Hamish knew him. Callum Ross, a delivery driver whose mother cleaned twice a week for the McIvers and once for half the people who liked to forget they needed cleaning. Callum had the open, anxious face of a lad still young enough to blush before lying. "Callum," said Hamish. "I'm late," said Callum at once. "I didna ask." "No." "Aye, I know." Blair turned. "What's this?" "Nothing," said Callum too quickly. Hamish looked at the van. Mud streaked the tyres. A length of brown paper poked from beneath a crate in the back. "You were up near Achnacairn yesterday morning?" Hamish asked. Callum swallowed. "I do deliveries." "To the Croft?" "Sometimes." "Did you see Ewan McIver carrying a wrapped bundle?" Callum's eyes moved toward Blair, then toward the shop window, where Nessie and Jessie had become interested in soap. "No." It was a poor lie, but a frightened one. Blair stepped forward. "Careful, son." Callum went pale. "My mother needs the work," he said. There it was. Not a confession, not evidence fit for a file, but the shape of the village laid bare. A man like Ewan did not need to threaten loudly. A quiet dependence could do the work. Hamish softened his voice. Nobody is asking you to harm your mother. Callum stared at the ground. I saw him, he whispered, before dawn, coming down by the side track. He had something wrapped in brown paper. Longish. He put it in the Land Rover. Why didn't you say? Blair snapped. Callum flinched. Hamish gave Blair a look. Because, Callum said, folk like us do not make trouble for folk like them. That silenced even Blair for a moment. From the shop doorway, Mrs. Patel had heard enough to understand, and too little to repeat safely. For once, she shut the door. Hamish watched Callum drive away, slower this time. The day had given him two things: a village ready to condemn the easy woman, and a frightened lad who had seen Yuan with a bundle before dawn. Neither proved murder. But together, they suggested the beautiful family story was not only false, it was being defended. Chapter 8. The Cradle Without a Quilt. By dusk, the storm had finally moved east, leaving Lochdubh shining with the wet, bruised light that comes after hard weather. Achnacairn Croft dripped from every slate. Water fell from the eaves into barrels, buckets, and one cracked basin Kirsty said had been catching leaks since the Queen's coronation and was too experienced to replace. The burn had dropped, but it still ran fast and brown below the house. The open day had been cancelled. No one had said it aloud with satisfaction, but several people had looked relieved. Hamish returned to the croft with Elspeth Grant, who had come on the respectable excuse of checking whether the newspaper feature should now become an obituary, a scandal, or something less useful to advertisers. I won't print anything that hurts Kirsty, she said as they crossed the yard. You'll print something that sells papers. I have layers. I, like an onion. Better than a policeman with one expression. I have two. This is the cheerful one. She looked at his face. Poor Lochdubh. Inside, the croft had the tired hush of a house after too many strangers. The kitchen fire was low. Mrs. Patel had gone home at last, leaving behind a covered dish and 3 instructions nobody had asked for. Kirsty was upstairs resting, which meant refusing to come down rather than sleeping. Yuan was in the front room, rearranging things that no longer had any audience. He turned when Hamish entered. I thought Inspector Blair had taken over. He tries, said Hamish. Elspeth looked around the room, notebook closed in her hand. Her eyes rested on the bare cradle beneath its sign. The massive cradle, used by 6 generations, with original family quilt. That sign sounds wrong, she said. Yuan stiffened. Wrong? Too polished. Too full of feeling. Kirsty's notes are blunt. Iron pot for washing. Boots, John's, resold twice. This reads like someone trying to make visitors cry before tea. Hamish glanced at her. I keep you about for your tact. You don't keep me about at all. That explains the piece. Yuan's face tightened. We were advised that heritage visitors respond to human stories. Only when they are human, said Elspeth. Hamish moved closer to the cradle. The blue enamel tag tied to it caught the lamplight. Number 17. Oval. Neat. Chipped along one edge. Where is the inventory board? He asked. Yuan hesitated. In the passage. The board hung beside the kitchen door. Rows of small hooks. Some holding blue enamel tags, each numbered in white. A little handwritten list beside it matched numbers to objects. There was a gap where 17 should have hung. Hamish studied the list. 17? Cradle quilt? Yes, said Yuan. And as you saw, 17 is on the cradle. No, said Hamish. A tag marked 17 is on the cradle. That is a distinction without meaning. It often is, until there's a body upstairs. Yuan said nothing. From the kitchen doorway came a heavy sigh. Luggs had followed Hamish in, and now lay across the threshold, making an obstacle of himself with great seriousness. When Blair appeared behind him a moment later, wet, red-faced, and impatient, the dog did not move. Shift that beast! Blair snapped. Luggs blinked once, Having assessed the request as beneath him, Elspeth turned away, not quite quickly enough to hide her smile. Blair stepped over lugs with poor grace. "What are you poking at now?" "Numbers," said Hamish. "Numbers do not kill people." "No, but people who change them sometimes do." Hamish went to the storage trunk near the inner wall. Earlier, it had held spare cloth, folded dust covers, and a rough grey blanket. Now, when he lifted the lid, he found the same grey blanket with a blue tag wired to one corner. Elspeth leaned in. 17 again. Blair scowled. "How many 17s does one dead blanket need?" "That," said Hamish, "is the first sensible question you've asked today." The tag on the blanket was newer than the others. The enamel had a cleaner shine, and along one edge a scrape had broken through the blue to the pale underlayer. Tiny flakes clung in the fold of the blanket beneath it. Hamish did not touch them at first. He only looked, then he took out an envelope and slid 2 flakes inside with the care of a man collecting words. Blair watched him. "Blue paint?" "Enamel." Fine. Blue enamel. On a tag. We know about the tags. We know there is an old missing tag 17, a newer tag 17 on the cradle, and another newer tag 17 fixed to a blanket that is no cradle quilt." Yuan spoke sharply. "Those tags were made for replacement. That proves nothing except poor administration." Elspeth looked at him. "Who ordered the replacements?" "I did." "And who decided which object got which number?" "I used the list." Hamish turned the list toward the light. "The handwriting changes beside 17. Yuan came closer. "That list has been handled by volunteers." "Kirsty's handwriting is cramped," said Elspeth. "Morag writes round letters. Yours leans right." The altered line leaned right. For a moment, Yuan looked at Elspeth with open dislike. Then the polished surface came back. "This is becoming absurd. The quilt is missing, yes. Miss Dale discovered an inconsistency, yes, but that does not make me a murderer." "No," said Hamish. "It makes you worried about the wrong thing." Blair folded his arms. "And what is the right thing?" Hamish looked at the bare cradle. The quilt itself. The room held still. Rainwater ticked from the eaves outside. Somewhere upstairs, Kirsty coughed once, then was quiet. Hamish imagined Victorine in the best room, lifting a tag, seeing a scraped edge, asking for the ledger, asking for item 17. He imagined Yuan smiling, delaying, offering smooth words while the real object was moved elsewhere. A false label could be corrected. A missing page could be explained. But a genuine quilt, with the genuine old tag still attached, would be harder to talk away. Hamish closed the trunk. "We'll need to look in Yuan's Land Rover." Yuan's face went very still. Blair saw it too. At last. Chapter 9. Sonsie and the best room chest. Blair wanted to search Yuan McIver's Land Rover immediately. That was why Hamish advised him not to. "You've changed your tune," said Blair, standing in the wet yard at Achnacairn with his coat collar up and his temper higher. "I've no changed the tune. I'm only keeping you from playing it on a cracked fiddle." Yuan stood a few yards away, face pale under the yard lamp. "I have nothing to hide, Inspector, but I object to being treated like a criminal because of a museum label." "People have been treated worse for less," said Blair. "Aye," said Hamish. "Often by you." Blair turned on him. "Macbeth." Hamish kept his voice mild. "If he refuses, and we force it wrong, he'll complain to everyone with a headed letter. Let McNab get the proper authority. Meanwhile, the vehicle doesna move." Yuan's eyes flickered. There it was again. Not fear exactly, but calculation interrupted. Blair hated waiting, but even he could see the sense in not giving Yuan an escape through procedure. A constable was left by the yard gate with instructions to watch the Land Rover, and everyone was sent back into the house or down the road. By the time Hamish returned to the police station, the night had turned clear and cold. The storm had blown itself out, leaving stars over the black line of the hills and a moon caught in broken cloud. His kitchen, however, remained damp and resentful. The borrowed electric ring on the table glowed red beneath a small pan of soup Mrs. Patel had labelled in handwriting that allowed no argument. Luggs lay under the table, with his nose tucked beneath his tail, having decided that police work after supper was unnecessary. Hamish sat with a mug between his hands and went over the case again. Victorine had seen that the quilt was wrong, or missing, or both. The old ledger named Item 17 as the blue and white cradle quilt. The tag board had lost its original number 17. A new number 17 had appeared on the cradle. Another had been fixed to a substitute blanket. The missing notebook page had likely named the same inconsistency. And Yuan had been seen before dawn with a wrapped bundle. That was enough to suspect him. It was not enough to understand him. Hamish did not like cases where motive was given too grand a coat. Saving the croft, preserving heritage, protecting the family. Such phrases had fine buttons, but underneath them there was usually debt, vanity, fear, or some smaller thing with sharper teeth. A soft scrape came at the back door. Hamish looked up. The scrape came again, followed by a sound of offended impatience. He opened the door. Sonsie slipped in, bringing the cold with her. She crossed the floor without greeting, sprang onto the chair, and dropped something onto Hamish's folded newspaper. It was a short length of old blue thread, twisted around a small metal ring. Hamish stared at it. Sonsie sat back and began washing one paw, as if the matter had now passed from competent paws to inferior hands. Hamish lifted the thread carefully. It was faded blue, thick and soft with age. Not thread from a modern blanket, not string from a label. Something older. The ring was small, the sort used with a tag or a travel trunk lock. "Where did you get this, then?" he asked. Sonsie ignored him. Luggs opened one eye, saw no food, and closed it again. Hamish fetched the letters Kirsty had let him copy notes from earlier. In one, Myrie had written of the blue binding worn thin where the wee hands pull it. Another mentioned the quilt being wrapped for storage in the old travel kist when the roof came in. Travel kist. Not best room chest. Not display trunk. A travel trunk. Hamish stood so quickly the chair scraped back. Sonsie looked satisfied. Before dawn, he was on the road back to Achnacairn. The constable at the yard gate was half frozen and wholly miserable. "Vehicle hasn't moved," he said. "Good lad. Can I go home now?" "In a wee while." "That means no." "It often does." Macnab arrived 10 minutes later, with authority enough to open the Land Rover and good sense enough not to announce it loudly. Blair arrived after him, complaining that dawn was an uncivilized hour invented by farmers and criminals. Yuan came out of the croft wearing yesterday's cardigan, over a shirt buttoned wrongly at the throat. "What is this now?" "A look in your vehicle," said Macnab. "I told you." "Aye," said Hamish. "You did." The rear of the Land Rover smelled of damp canvas, oil, and old straw. At first, there were only ordinary things. Rope, a torch, a box of leaflets for the cancelled open day, a sack of kindling, and a folded tarpaulin. Then Hamish saw fresh scrape marks on the floor panel. He lifted the tarpaulin. Beneath it sat a dark leather travel trunk, its brass corners green with age. Around its handle clung a single thread of faded blue. Yuan made a sound, small and involuntary. Blair heard it and smiled. Macnab opened the trunk. Inside, wrapped in brown paper and an old sheet, lay the cradle quilt. It was not grand. That was the first thing Hamish thought. It was worn, faded, blue and white, patched in places with a care more practical than pretty. Along one edge, the binding had thinned, where many hands had held it, folded it, lifted it, or perhaps only remembered someone under it. Attached to one corner was an old blue enamel tag, number 17. The edge was chipped. Hamish bent close. The chip matched the broken sharpness of the flake from Victorine's sleeve. Fresh, blue, pale underlayer, newly exposed. Blair said, Well. Yuan's mouth worked before words came. "I was keeping it safe." "No," said Hamish softly. "You were keeping it away." Yuan looked toward the croft. In the upper window, Kirsty stood behind the glass, small and still in the morning light. Hamish did not wave. Some truths were heavy enough without being held up for show. He closed the trunk gently. The quilt had been found. Now all that remained was to make Yuan say why Victorine Dale had not been allowed to find it first. Chapter 10. The Family Table. By 9 o'clock, Achnacairn's kitchen was full. No one had invited half the village. That was not how Lochdubh worked. Roads reopened. Word slipped downhill, and people arrived carrying reasons: a pot to return, a message to deliver, a lift to offer, a shawl Kirsty might need, a question that could wait but somehow did not. Mrs. Patel came with bread. Nessie and Jessie Curry came with concern, though Jessie carried it more visibly and Nessie more quickly. Elspeth came with a closed notebook, which was her way of promising restraint while keeping her options alive. Blair came late, sweating despite the cold, and announced from the doorway, "Right! Enough of this village parliament!" Lugs, who had installed himself beneath Kirsty's chair after discovering she dropped crumbs without noticing, lifted his head and gave Blair no assistance at all. Yuan sat at the far end of the kitchen table. He had recovered some of his polish, but not all of it. The missing portion was the more interesting part. His hands rested flat on the wood, too still. A man trying not to reach for anything. Kirsty sat opposite him, wrapped in her cardigan, smaller than ever and somehow harder. The cradle quilt lay on the table between them. It looked poor in that crowded kitchen. Faded blue and white, worn at the edges, patched without elegance. Yet the room had changed when Hamish laid it there. The polished labels in the front room had asked people to admire. The quilt asked them to be quiet. Blair cleared his throat. "I am arresting Kirsty McIver pending further." "No," said Hamish. It was a mild word, but it landed cleanly. Blair turned slowly. "What did you say?" "I said no. You don't give orders here, Macbeth. Then consider it advice before you embarrass yourself further." Nessie drew in a breath. Jessie clutched her handbag. Blair's face darkened. "That old woman had motive, key access, family shame, hidden letters, and hands that could barely twist a tag wire," said Hamish. "A respect for the truth she was accused of fearing, and no reason to move the quilt before Miss Dale found it." Yuan spoke then, very quietly. "This is cruel. My aunt has suffered enough." Hamish looked at him. "Aye," he said. "That is true, but not in the way you mean." The room settled. Hamish touched the old blue enamel tag attached to the quilt, not moving it, only indicating it. "Victorine Dale came here to inspect objects, not feelings. That made her dangerous, because this house had been arranged to make feelings do the work of facts." Yuan's mouth tightened. "We wanted visitors to understand the family." "No. You wanted them to admire it. That is not a crime. Not by itself." Hamish lifted the replacement tag from an envelope and placed it beside the original. Both were marked 17. One was old, dulled by age, chipped along an edge recently broken. The other was newer, scraped raw where enamel had flaked away. Item 17 was the cradle quilt. The ledger said so. Kirsty knew it. Victorine saw the label did not match the object. Then she asked for the quilt, the ledger, and the older notes. Blair folded his arms. "We know all this." "You knew pieces," said Hamish. "You kept trying to make them point at Kirsty because she was easier to understand." Kirsty looked down. It was not gratitude on her face. Gratitude would have been too simple. It was the wary exhaustion of a woman who had been rescued from one humiliation by the exposure of another. Hamish continued. "The quilt in the cradle was missing. A substitute blanket had been given a newer tag marked 17. Another newer tag was put where the old one should have been. That was not confusion. That was cover," Yuan said. "Museum preparation is messy." "Aye. But murder is messier." No one moved. Victorine found the inconsistency. She wrote it in her notebook. Cradle quilt provenance inconsistent, tag 17. The page was torn out because it named the proof. Not the family story. Not Myrie's old sorrow. The tag. Hamish turned to the room. The blue enamel mattered 3 times. First, flakes fell from the tag at the cradle when Victorine handled it. Second, a fresh flake was found on Victorine's sleeve in the best room. Third, the substitute tag and the real tag both show fresh scraping, because as someone was changing numbers and moving proof in a hurry. Mrs. Patel's gaze moved to Yuan's hands. Miss Dale confronted you, Hamish said to him. Not Kirsty, you. Yuan gave a small laugh. I was downstairs with the others. For some of the evening. Not all. And in this house, a man who knows the stairs can move quietly enough when people are making tea, arguing, and listening to rain. Blair said, What about the locked room? Hamish nodded toward the stair. The best room key was on the outside when Ewan found it. He wanted us to think Victorine had locked herself in, or that an old house had confused matters. The window latch was scratched from inside, but there were no footprints below. The latch was theatre, like the labels. Yuan's voice sharpened. You are inventing. No. I'm reading your display. That hurt him more than accusation. Hamish placed a second envelope on the table. Victorine's missing notebook page was found this morning. Yuan blinked. Blair looked at Hamish. Where? In the ash trap of the kitchen range. Burned at the edges. Not fully gone. Mrs. Patel had emptied the upper ash after supper, but not the lower tray. You were in a hurry, Yuan. Mrs. Patel looked surprised, then thoughtful. I wondered why the tray had been pushed in crooked. Yuan stared at her. Hamish said. The words left were enough. Tag 17 original, not on cradle. Query removal of genuine textiles. Elspeth's eyes lifted. Textiles, she said softly. Plural. Hamish nodded. Aye. The quilt was not the only thing. Yuan's face changed. It was not confession yet. It was the collapse before confession, when a person understands which door has shut. Hamish went on. There were empty spaces in this collection hidden by good lighting and better stories. The real fishing knife was gone. The older pewter spoons were gone. A shawl had been replaced with something later. The quilt was wrapped for sale. Kirsty whispered. Sale? Yuan turned to her. To save the croft. No, said Hamish. To save yourself as the man who saved the croft. Yuan stood so abruptly the chair scraped the floor. You don't know what it costs to keep this place. Roof, lawyers, grants, damp, committees, relatives who complain but cannot pay. Everyone wants heritage until the bill comes. I found collectors who would pay properly. Private homes. Safe homes. The objects would survive. And the village would see copies, said Elspeth. They would see the story. Kirsty's voice was thin. Whose story? Yuan looked at her, and for the first time there was anger without polish. You would have let the place rot, rather than let me make it something. I would have let it be poor, before I let it be false. Blair stepped forward. Did you kill Victorine Dale? Yuan's mouth closed. Hamish answered for him. Quietly. She found the quilt in the best room, or near enough. She saw the old tag still attached. She knew the replacements meant deliberate fraud. She was going to stop the opening and report the removals. Yuan's hands shook once. She wouldn't listen, he said. No one spoke. She spoke as if it was simple. As if truth pays invoices. As if accuracy mends roofs. His voice roughened. She said I had turned grief into merchandise. Kirsty closed her eyes. Yuan looked at the quilt. I only meant to frighten her. I pulled the shelf forward. She stepped back. She fell. I thought. He stopped. I thought, if it looked like an accident, the croft might still open. There was so much rain, so much confusion. And after? Asked Hamish. Yuan swallowed. I moved the quilt to the Land Rover, tore the page, put the key where it would be found, I thought Kirsty's letters would explain enough. Enough for you, said Hamish. Blair moved then, eager and official. Yuan McKeever, I am arresting you. This time Hamish did not stop him. As Blair recited the words, Yuan looked less like a villain than a man who had mistaken admiration for rescue and found, too late, that admiration was hungry. When he was taken out, the kitchen remained silent. Then Jessie Curry, who had been crying without quite admitting it, said, It is a very plain quilt. Kirsty opened her eyes. Aye, she said. It was never meant to impress you. No one answered. Outside, the burn ran lower over the stones. Inside, the family table held a faded quilt, 2 blue tags, and the cost of making a beautiful lie look permanent. Chapter 11. The Open Door. After Yuan was taken away, Cairncroft seemed to exhale. It was not peace exactly. Peace would have been too generous. The house still smelled of damp wool, peat, smoke, and grief. The front room still held its neat rows of objects, though now every label looked slightly ashamed of itself. Upstairs, the best room door stood open, and cold air moved through the passage as if the house wanted rid of what had happened there. By noon, the burn had dropped below the bridgestones. The track was passable again, though nobody trusted it enough to drive quickly. A pale sun came through the cloud in brief, uncertain patches. Blair stood in the yard speaking to Macnab in the loud voice of a man preparing his version for Strathbane. Aye. Well, I had my eye on McIver from the start. Too smooth by half. You learn to spot these heritage types. Hamish, leaning against the gate, said nothing. Blair pointed toward the house. And that old spinning barrel in there. Spinning wheel, said Hamish. That's what I said. And the washing cauldron. Meal gurnal? Blair glared. Are you opening a museum now, Macbeth? No. I'm only trying to keep the evidence from being insulted. Macnab turned away to hide a smile. Blair claimed 2 more insights, misnamed a pair of wool cards, and left in a spray of mud, looking satisfied enough for 3 detectives. Hamish watched him go. There were battles not worth winning, especially when Blair's report would be corrected by facts, clerks, and his own spelling. Inside, Kirsty sat at the kitchen table with the cradle quilt folded before her. She had not cried when Yuan confessed. She had not cried when the quilt was found. Now, with the house quieter, and the worst of the watching over, her eyes looked sore and dry. Mrs. Patel stood at the range, heating soup she had somehow produced from a basket that had previously contained only bread. Elspeth sat opposite Kirsty, her notebook closed. I'll not use what you don't want used, Elspeth said. Kirsty looked at her. That is kind. But kindness has done too much tidying in this house. Elspeth waited. Kirsty touched the quilt's worn blue edge. You can write that it was made after Myrie lost her child. Not as a disgrace. Not as a tragedy to sell tickets. Just as what happened. That is what I'll write. And you can write that some things were stolen before anyone called it preservation. Mrs. Patel stirred the soup. Not stolen by the village, she said softly. No, said Kirsty. By family, which is sometimes harder to say. Hamish stood near the door, letting the women shape the truth without him. Luggs had settled beneath the table beside Kirsty's boots, his chin resting on one paw, alert only to the possibility of falling crumbs. The dog had chosen his allegiance, and for once Hamish approved of his judgment. Morag came in, carrying a cardboard box of labels. I found these in the passage, she said. Do we throw them away? Kirsty looked at the printed cards Yuan had ordered. Elegant, cream-coloured, and wrong. No, she said. We'll turn them over. Hamish smiled. For the next hour, the kitchen became something like a workshop and something like a wake. The perfect labels were reversed. Kirsty dictated plain facts. Morag wrote them down in careful block letters. Elspeth helped with dates. Mrs. Patel corrected spelling when nobody asked her to, and was right every time. Iron pot used for washing and boiling cloth. Not festive. Church wrap belonged, to Effie McIver. Later than first claimed. Cradle quilt made from family cloth after a child's death. Blue binding repaired twice. Some gaps in the story remain. Kirsty read that last one twice. Too long, she said. It is allowed to take space, said Elspeth. Kirsty gave her a look, then nodded. The old blue enamel tag, number 17, was fixed again to the quilt. Not polished, not straightened. It hung from the worn corner with its chipped edge visible. Should it not be repaired? Morag asked. No, said Kirsty. Let it show where it broke. A little later, Callum Ross came to the back door with a delivery of paraffin and the expression of a lad expecting punishment from several directions. Hamish met him outside. My mother will lose the cleaning, Callum said before Hamish could speak. No, she won't. You cannot know that. I can make sure of some things. Callum looked doubtful. Hamish kept his voice easy. Yuan's no longer giving orders at Achnacairn. Kirsty will need help. Your mother knows the house, and Mrs. Patel knows everyone who might try to make trouble about it. That sounds worse than the police. It is, usually. A reluctant smile appeared and vanished. You'll not put my name in the paper? No. Elspeth? No. Callum nodded, relieved and embarrassed by relief. Thank you. Next time, said Hamish. Come sooner. Callum stared at the mud. Aye. That was enough. By late afternoon, the front door of Achnacairn stood open to air the damp from the passage. The house looked less like a museum now and more like itself. Uneven, smoky, full of patched things and uncomfortable truths. The Heritage Committee would have opinions. Grant forms would need revising. Certain collectors would receive awkward letters. The open day would not happen that Saturday, but Kirsty had already decided it would happen later. Fewer objects, she told Hamish as he prepared to leave. Better labels. Less impressive, he said. More honest. That usually lasts longer. She walked with him to the door. For a moment they stood looking out at the pale light on the wet yard. I thought the truth would take the house from me, she said. Hamish glanced back at the kitchen, where Morag was placing the reversed labels in a careful stack and Mrs. Patel was wrapping leftover bannocks as if feeding the entire parish were a private habit. Maybe it's given it back, he said. Kirsty did not answer, but her hand rested on the doorframe. It was a possessive touch, and a tender one. When Hamish returned to Lochdubh, smoke was rising properly from the police station chimney. He stopped outside and stared at it. Inside, the stove repairman was kneeling on the kitchen floor while Mrs. Patel stood over him with the calm authority of a field marshal. Sonsie sat on the windowsill, pretending no interest in the proceedings. Luggs pushed past Hamish and made straight for the new warmth, then lowered himself in front of the stove with a sigh that suggested he had borne the whole crisis alone. I did not ask for an invasion, said Hamish. Mrs. Patel handed him a bill, already folded. No. That is why one was necessary. The stove gave a small, smoky cough, then settled into a steady heat. Hamish warmed his hands and looked out through the window toward the darkening line of the hills. Somewhere above Lochdubh, Achnacairn Croft stood with its door open, its quilt returned, and its beautiful lies turned over to make room for plainer words. It was not a neat ending, but Hamish had never trusted neatness. Outside, the evening came down cold and clear. Inside, for once, the fire behaved. Achnacairn Croft did open in the end, though not with the glossy story Yuan McIver had planned. Visitors found fewer perfect labels than expected. Some objects were missing because they had been sold, and some stories had gaps no one could fill. The cradle quilt lay in its chest, with the old blue enamel tag still attached, chipped edge and all. Beside it was a plain note in Kirsty McIver's hand. Family quilt, made from grief, use, and memory. Some parts of its story remain uncertain. That small blue tag had been meant to fix a number to an object. Instead, its broken edge marked the truth. Even old things, it seemed, could object when people used them to tell new lies. There is a difference between preserving history and owning it. A family story may be patched, faded, and incomplete, but it is still better than a polished copy made to win applause. Back in Lochdubh, Kettles boiled, gossip softened into apology, and Hamish's repaired stove smoked once before behaving itself. Mrs. Patel pretended she had not arranged the whole matter. Lugg slept beside the warmth, as if he had suffered most. Sonsie vanished into the dusk, with the air of a creature who had inspected the truth and found humans slow. And if an old family story is partly false, would you rather keep the beautiful version or hear the untidy truth? Thank you for visiting Lochdubh with us tonight. If this tale of old quilts, stormy roads, and chipped blue enamel kept you listening, leave a quiet light in the window for the next Highland mystery. And remember, when the storm traps everyone at Achnacairn Croft, Hamish follows a blue enamel chip to the truth hidden in plain sight.